The ground was already frozen the morning they buried Thomas Harrow. It had been frozen for 3 weeks, long enough that the grave diggers had needed pickaxes instead of shovels, long enough that the soil came up in dark, reluctant chunks that looked nothing like earth and everything like something broken. The sky above Harrow Creek that morning was the color of old pewter, flat and heavy, pressing down on the valley like a hand that had decided to stay. Nora stood at the edge of the grave in her black wool dress and watched them lower her husband into ground that did not want to receive him. She had sewn the dress herself 2 winters ago from fabric she had ordered out of a catalog and waited 6 weeks to arrive. She had made it for occasions she hoped would be far away, the death of someone elderly, someone who had lived fully and was ready. She had not made it for this. She had not made it for a man of 34 who had gone out one morning to check the north fence line and come back 3 days later on a board carried by 2 ranch hands, his face the color of the February sky. The doctor said it was his heart. Edmund Harrow stood 20 feet away, not beside her, not near her. He stood with the men from town, the ones who ran the feed store and the lumber yard and the land office men who had known Thomas since he was a boy and who now looked at the ground or at the sky or at each other anywhere but at the woman Thomas had married 6 years ago and brought home to a town that had never fully decided what to do with her. Edmund did not look at the ground. Edmund looked at the grave. He was a tall man, Edmund Harrow, with the kind of face that years of running a general store in a hard country will produce: angular, weathered, the skin pulled tight across the jaw, eyes that had learned to calculate before they learned to feel. He wore his good coat, the dark one with the brass buttons, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him, and he did not once look at Nora. She noticed. She had been noticing things about Edmund for 6 years, cataloging them the way a woman catalogs the weather in a country where weather can kill you. The way he spoke to Thomas in a room and seemed to forget she was there. The way he referred to the land, always the land, the store, the property, as though these things were living members of the family in a way that she was not. The way he had never once in 6 years called her by her name in a tone that meant anything other than transaction. She had told herself it would get easier. She had told herself he needed time. She had been wrong about that, but she had not yet learned how wrong. The preacher finished speaking. Someone threw the first handful of frozen dirt into the grave, and it landed with a sound that Nora felt in her back teeth. She did not cry. She had cried for 3 days in the room she had shared with Thomas, alone in the dark with the door closed. She had given herself those 3 days. She had told herself that public grief was a private thing, worn inside out, and that she would keep hers where it belonged. She kept it there now at the graveside while the town of Harrow Creek watched her without watching her, and Edmund Harrow stood 20 feet away and looked at the grave of his son. That evening he came for her. She was in the kitchen of the house when she heard the knock at the back door, not the front, which told her everything she needed to know before she even opened it. The front door was for equals. The back door was for deliveries and employees and people whose presence you were willing to acknowledge but not welcome. She opened it. Edmund stood on the back step with his hat in his hand and his eyes already set to the expression she had learned to recognize, the one that meant a decision had already been made. And this conversation was a formality, not a negotiation. "I'd like a word," he said. She stood back and let him in. He sat down at the table without being asked, which was the kind of thing Edmund Harrow did in every room he entered. He sat down as though the furniture had been placed there for him, specifically as though the walls had been built around his comfort. He set his hat on the table beside him and folded his hands and looked at her with eyes that were not unkind exactly, but were something worse than unkind. They were final. "The property bought," he said, "belongs to the family." Nora sat down across from him. She kept her hands in her lap. She kept her face still. "Thomas and I were married," she said. "I know what you were." He said it quietly, which was how Edmund said everything. She had never once heard him raise his voice. She had come to understand that men who never raise their voices are often the most dangerous kind because their anger has nowhere to go except into the weight of their words. Marriage doesn't change bloodline. The land, the store, the house, these things go back to the family. That's how it's always been done. That's how Thomas would have wanted it. "Thomas never said that to me." Edmund looked at her for a moment. Just looked. The way a man looks at something he has already decided to move past. "Thomas said a great many things," he said. "Some of them were between him and me." She wanted to ask what that meant. She wanted to push on it, press into it, find out what was hidden inside that sentence. But she was sitting in a kitchen that was no longer hers, in a house that was no longer hers, across from a man who had already finished making up his mind, and she understood in the bone-deep way that women in hard circumstances learn to understand things that asking the question would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. "How long do I have?" she asked instead. Edmund picked up his hat. "The week is fair," he said. "Take what's yours." He stood. He walked to the back door. He opened it and stepped through it and closed it behind him with a sound that was not a slam. It was careful, deliberate, controlled, and that careful sound carried more weight than any door she had ever heard slam in her life. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he left. She looked at the walls she had painted herself in the second year of their marriage, the pale yellow she had chosen because Thomas had said it made the room feel like morning. She looked at the curtains she had sewn from fabric she had carried 40 miles on horseback from the dry goods store in Billings. She looked at the cast iron pot hanging above the stove and the wooden spoon on the counter and the small tin of coffee that was half full. Then she stood up and she began to decide what was hers. It was less than she expected. It is always less than you expect when you begin to separate yourself from a life you built alongside someone else. The clothes, of course, her grandmother's thimble, the small mirror with the carved wooden frame that had come west with her in the wagon, a good wool shawl, her sewing kit because that was unquestionably hers, every needle and every spool of thread paid for with money she had earned mending for other families. And the quilt. She had made it the summer before she married Thomas in the long evenings, when the light lasted late and she had sat on the porch of her father's house and worked by the natural glow of the Montana sky. She had used pieces of dresses she had worn as a girl fabric from her mother's apron, a square cut from the shirt her father had been wearing the day she learned to ride. It was the most personal object she owned. It was the most personal object she had ever made. She had been saving it. She did not say for what. She had simply been saving it the way you save certain things, not because you have a plan for them, but because you understand that the day will come when you will need what they can give you more than you need to keep them. She folded it carefully, more carefully than anything else she packed, and she set it on the table. Then she went to sleep for the last time in that house. The next 4 days, she quietly sold what she could. The quilt went to Edna Marsh, who had admired it for years and who paid without haggling, because she could see from Nora's face that this was not the moment for haggling. The price was $5. 5 coins. She held them in her palm and looked at them for a moment, standing in Edna Marsh's front hallway, with the winter light coming through the window and the smell of someone else's supper in the air. 5 coins for the work of her hands and the fabric of her childhood in the 6 years she had spent building something she had been told was not hers to keep. She put them in the hidden pocket she had sewn into the seam of her petticoat, where she kept things that mattered. On the 5th day, she walked out of the house with a single burlap sack and the echo of Edmund's voice still present in her chest, not ringing, not loud, just present the way cold is present when it has been inside you long enough to feel normal. She walked down Main Street. Harrow Creek was not a large town, but it was a real one, the kind that had been built by people who intended to stay and had constructed their intentions in wood and stone, and the stubborn particularity of frontier commerce. There was the general store, Edmund's store, with its wide porch and its smell of leather and grain and coal oil. There was the feed store and the livery and the land office and the small white church at the far end of the street that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. There was the sheriff's office with its single barred window facing the street. She walked past all of it. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and she did not look at the windows, though she felt the windows looking at her. Small towns have a particular way of watching a woman who is walking through them in reduced circumstances. It is not always cruel. Sometimes it is simply the helpless staring of people who do not know what to say, and so say nothing, which can feel more isolating than cruelty, because at least cruelty acknowledges you. She was almost past the sheriff's office when she saw the paper. It was nailed to a wooden post at the edge of the boardwalk, yellowed at the edges and curled from months of weather, the kind of notice that had been put up so long ago that people had stopped seeing it. A tax deed. She stopped walking and read it. Cabin, 3 miles north along the upper creek. Declared unfit for habitation by the county assessor. Property of Harrow County. Price of outstanding taxes $5. She read it twice. She put her hand into the hidden pocket of her petticoat and touched the 5 coins. The door of the sheriff's office opened, and Sheriff Vance stepped out onto the porch. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with a gray mustache and the eyes of someone who had seen enough of human nature to have opinions about it, but was too tired to share them unsolicited. He looked at Nora. He looked at the paper she was reading. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, not quite grief, but the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something he should have put down a long time ago. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "is this still available?" She held the paper toward him without preamble. He looked at it as though he needed a moment to remember it existed. "That property hasn't had a buyer in 2 years," he said. "The last man who lived up there—" He stopped. "I heard," she said. "Is it still available?" Vance looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the burlap sack in her hand and the set of her jaw and the 5 coins she had not yet shown him, but that he seemed to understand were somewhere on her person. "That cabin is a ruin," he said. "I've been up there. The roof's half gone. The chimney's collapsed. There's no fire, no stored wood. No, Mrs. Harrow, winter isn't coming. Winter is here. You'd be 3 miles from the nearest building in the worst season of the year, in a structure that a strong wind could finish off." "I know what it is," she said. "Is it available?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that a man settles into when he has run out of arguments that he believes in. $5, he said. She reached into her pocket and placed the coins on the railing between them. He looked at them. He looked at her. He picked up the coins and turned back into his office without another word. She waited. He came out 4 minutes later with a signed deed, the ink still damp, and handed it to her. "Good luck, Mrs. Harrow," he said. His voice had something in it she couldn't quite name, not pity exactly, something older than pity. "You're going to need it." She folded the deed and put it in the same pocket where the coins had been. She turned north. The walk was 3 miles, which in summer along a dry trail would have been an hour's easy travel. In February in Montana, with 8 inches of snow on the ground, and more coming with a burlap sack in one hand, and boots that were good but not made for this, it was something else entirely. The cold did not announce itself. It simply arrived incrementally, working its way through the wool of her shawl and the layers of her dress and the leather of her boots until it was no longer something outside her, but something inside her, a presence that had taken up residence in her bones and was settling in for a long stay. She did not stop. She had learned somewhere in the course of her life, she could not have said exactly where, exactly when, that stopping in difficult circumstances was the most dangerous thing you could do. Not because stopping was fatal in itself, but because stopping gave you time to think, and thinking gave you access to the full weight of your situation, and the full weight of your situation was something that had to be carried in motion, or it would crush you where you stood. She kept moving. The trail north wound along the creek, which was frozen solid, its surface a dull pewter that matched the sky. The trees on either side were bare, their branches coated in ice that caught what little light remained in the day and gave it back in cold, colorless sparks. She passed no one. There was no one to pass. The land up here had been logged over a decade ago and not yet grown back fully, so the landscape had the particular desolation of a place that had been used hard and then abandoned stumps, rotting under the snow scrub brush, filling the gaps where great trees had stood. After 2 miles, the trail began to climb. The ridge was not dramatic by Montana standards. It rose maybe 300 feet above the valley floor. Nothing compared to the peaks visible on clear days to the west. But in February, with a full load of cold and a burlap sack that felt heavier, with every step, those 300 feet were their own kind of mountain. She climbed them. She was breathing hard by the time the trail leveled out, and she came around a stand of bare aspens into a small clearing. She stopped. The cabin stood in the clearing like something that had given up. It had been built well once she could see that in the bones of it, in the careful notching of the logs at the corners, in the size of the stones that had been gathered for the chimney foundation. Someone had put real work into this place, real intention. But intention and work are only as good as the ongoing presence of someone who gives a damn, and whoever had last given a damn about this cabin had been gone for years. A gap ran along the north wall where the chinking had fallen out wide enough to put a forearm through. A full section of the roof, maybe a quarter of the total, had collapsed inward, leaving a ragged hole through which the sky was plainly visible. Snow had drifted through that hole and through the gaps in the walls and lay in uneven patches across the dirt floor inside. The chimney, which should have been the spine of the place, was a scatter of stones half buried in snow, the structure above the roofline entirely gone. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at all of this. The moon was coming up thin and cold, a blade of light above the tree line to the east. It did not illuminate so much as make the dark more specific. She walked to the cabin door, which was hanging on one hinge and required lifting and pushing to open, and she went inside. The cold inside was the same as the cold outside. There was no distinction, no shelter, no warmth that had been trapped and held. The walls kept out the wind, mostly except where they didn't. The roof kept out the snow, mostly except where it didn't. The floor was hard-packed dirt, dark and frozen indifferent to her presence. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking inventory the way her grandmother had taught her to take inventory, not with emotion, not with judgment, but with the clear eyes of someone who needs to know exactly what she has to work with. North wall gap in chinking, manageable. East wall solid, no visible damage. South wall solid, door needs rehinging. West wall 2 gaps smaller than the north, manageable. Roof, the collapsed section was in the northwest corner. The rest appeared to be holding, though she could not be certain until morning light let her see it clearly. Chimney gone above the roofline. The hearth base, from what she could see, might still be intact beneath the debris. Floor usable. She found the corner where the roof was strongest, the southeast corner away from the collapse, where 2 solid walls met under an intact beam, and she went to it. She swept the snow from that corner with her boot, clearing a patch of floor. She set her burlap sack against the wall. She took out her wool shawl, which she had been wearing, and she arranged it around herself as thoroughly as it would go. She sat down with her back against the rough bark of the logs. The cold pressed in from all sides. Every sound the forest made in the darkness, the crack of a branch under ice, the distant complaint of a tree pushed by wind, came through the walls, clearly, each one arriving like a small announcement of everything that was working against her. She did not sleep so much as drift in and out of a thin, cold consciousness, each returned to awareness accompanied by a new understanding of how much of the night remained. At some point, the moon set. At some point, the darkness became absolute. At some point, far off and barely perceptible, the sky began to differentiate itself from the tree line, and gray light started slow, reluctant entry into the world. Dawn came the way it comes in hard winters, not as warmth or relief, but simply as visibility, the ability to see what you are dealing with. She had been dealing with it all night. Now she could see it. She was looking at the gap in the north wall, estimating how many trips to the creek it would take to dig up enough clay to fill it when the doorway darkened. She was on her feet before the figure fully appeared, her heart arriving at a full run before her mind had time to explain the threat. She spun to face the door, her back against the east wall, and for one suspended moment the world contracted to the shape in the doorway and the thunderous sound of her own pulse. The shape was a woman, old, not elderly exactly, but seasoned in the way that certain people are seasoned by decades of outdoor living, the skin weathered and deeply lined, the posture neither bent nor stiff, but simply settled the way a tree settles into its lean over years of prevailing wind. She was wrapped in a coat that appeared to have been assembled from multiple animal hides over a long period of time, none of them matching, all of them functional. In one hand, she held a ceramic jug, chipped at the handle, from which a thread of steam was rising into the cold morning air. Her eyes were sharp, specifically sharp, the eyes of someone who has spent a long time watching things carefully and drawing accurate conclusions from what she sees. She looked at Nora the way a person looks at a problem they are deciding whether to involve themselves in. "I saw smoke from my camp down in the hollow," she said. Her voice was dry and direct, with the slight rasp of someone who spends more time outdoors than in and has made a permanent accommodation with cold air. "But you've got no fire here." "Not yet," Nora said. The woman looked around the cabin with the expression of someone taking inventory, the same kind of inventory Nora had taken the night before. She looked at the gaps in the walls, and the hole in the roof, and the scatter of chimney stones, and the cold hearth buried in debris. She looked at the corner where Nora had slept, the swept patch of floor, the arranged shawl. "You bought this place," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yesterday," Nora said. "My name is Nora." "Agnes." The woman stepped inside, which required ducking slightly under the damaged door frame. She held out the ceramic jug. "Cider. Still warm mostly." Nora took it and drank. The warmth hit her like something she had forgotten was possible. It spread from her throat downward, moving through her chest and into her arms, reaching toward extremities that had been operating on pure stubbornness for the past 12 hours. It tasted like apples and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of something that has been kept near a fire all night. She drank more than she intended to. She stopped herself. Agnes was watching her with those sharp eyes. "You'll need to seal those gaps before the sun goes down again," Agnes said. "There's clay by the creek 50 yards downstream from where the trail crosses. Frozen on top, but dig down a foot, and you'll find it workable. Mix it with dry grass, you'll find plenty of that along the bank, and pack it tight. Don't rush it. Rush chinking falls out." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small trowel. The metal rusted, but the handle worn smooth from long use. She held it out. Nora took it. "Keep it," Agnes said. "Better than bleeding your fingernails off." Nora looked at the trowel in her hand. It was a small thing. It was the smallest possible kind of help. And yet, standing in that cold, half-ruined room with the warmth of borrowed cider still working through her chest, it felt like something she could not adequately name. "Thank you," she said. Agnes looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not warmth exactly, but was something related to warmth. The way the heat held in a stone hours after the fire has gone out is related to the fire that made it. "My husband quit on that same floor," Agnes said. Nora looked at her. "The man who lived here before you." Agnes said it without flinching, the way you say a thing you have had a long time to make your peace with. "He was my husband. Came up here because we had nowhere else to go, same as you. First winter got into him. He stopped fighting it." A pause. "They found him in the spring." The words landed in the cold air between them. "I stayed in the hollow after that," Agnes said. "People in town thought I was strange for not coming back. Maybe I was, but going back felt like saying they were right, that this ridge was no place for people without connections, without bloodlines, without the right last name." She paused again. "Don't let them be right." Then she turned and walked back through the door and into the mist, which had thickened since dawn, and within 30 steps she was gone, as though the morning had simply taken her back. Nora stood in the doorway for a long moment. She looked at the trowel in her hand. She looked at the gaps in the north wall. She looked at the clearing around the cabin, the bare aspens at the edge, the pewter sky above. She thought about a man who had given up on that same floor. She thought about a woman who had stayed in the hollow for years rather than walk back into a town that had decided she didn't count. She thought about Edmund Harrow's voice in the kitchen, quiet and final as a closed door. Then she picked up her burlap sack and walked toward the creek. The clay was where Agnes said it would be, 50 yards downstream on the near bank, the surface frozen into a dull gray crust that required the trowel in both hands to break through. Below the crust, maybe 10 inches down, she found it dark, dense, cold, but pliable with the particular heavy quality of material that has been waiting underground for exactly the use you have in mind. She dug. Her hands were not built for this. They were capable hands accustomed to hard work. She had been sewing and cooking and cleaning and gardening and mending for her entire adult life, but they had not been built for breaking frozen ground. And the difference between capable and built for was she was discovering meaningful. The cold moved up through the trowel handle and settled in her palms. Her fingers, after 20 minutes, began to operate more on memory than sensation. She kept digging. She carried the clay back to the cabin in her skirt, holding the fabric up like a basin, losing some on the way, arriving with what she had. She set it down near the north wall and went back for dry grass from the creek bank, pulling it in handfuls from where it stood stiff and pale above the snow line. She carried that back too. She mixed them together on the floor of the cabin, working the grass into the clay with her hands until the consistency felt right, or rather until it felt like the description Agnes had given her felt right, because she had never done this before, and right was a target she was navigating by instinct and the memory of someone else's instructions. She pressed the mixture into the north wall gap. It went in harder than she expected. The gap was wide and the log surfaces on either side were rough and uneven, and getting the clay to adhere to both while filling the space between required a particular angle of application and a particular degree of pressure that she had to discover by trial and error with cold hands in a room where the temperature was not noticeably different from the temperature outside. She worked. She filled 6 inches of gap, then stepped back and looked at it. It was not elegant. It was not what a craftsman would have produced. But it was solid and it was sealed, and no wind was coming through those 6 inches anymore. She went back to the creek. She made 4 more trips that morning, carrying clay and grass in alternating loads, working the mixture on the cabin floor, pressing it into the wall with numb hands. By midday, if the pale, directionless thickening of the light above the clouds could be called midday, she had sealed perhaps 3 feet of the gap. Then she stopped. She stopped because she had to. Not because she wanted to, not because she had given herself permission to, but because her body made the decision for her. Her hands had crossed some threshold beyond which they were no longer taking instructions, and she sat down in the middle of the cabin floor and held them in her lap and looked at them. They were shaking, they were red from cold and dark at the knuckles from clay. 2 of her fingernails had cracked. There was a cut along her right palm from the edge of the trowel that she had not felt until now. She sat there and looked at her hands and let the full weight of the situation find her. It found her completely. She was alone on a ridge 3 miles from the nearest building in the worst month of the Montana winter, in a structure that was not yet reliably weatherproof, with no fire and no food and no one who was coming to help her. She had $5 in coins that she had already spent. She had a trowel and a borrowed jug. She had the clothes on her back and whatever was in the burlap sack and the deed to this place that was sitting in her petticoat pocket alongside nothing. Edmund Harrow had stood in her kitchen and told her she was not blood, not family, not the kind of person this land stayed with. And sitting on the frozen floor of a ruined cabin with cracked hands and the cold working its way through every layer she owned, and she felt for the first and only time the beginning of a question she did not want to answer. What if he was right? What if the reason she had no place here, no home, no standing, no welcome, was not because of Edmund's cruelty, but because of something true? What if the thing he had seen in her, the insufficiency he had named with such quiet confidence, was real? She sat with that question. She sat with it while the cold settled deeper and the thin light above the clouds moved imperceptibly toward afternoon, and the sounds of the forest came through the walls with complete indifference to her presence or her doubt. She sat with it until she thought of Agnes. Not Agnes's words exactly, though the words were there exactly where Agnes had placed them, but Agnes herself. The image of her, that worn coat assembled from mismatched hides, those sharp eyes, that chipped ceramic jug held out across the cold air between them. A woman who had lost her husband in this exact room. A woman who had stayed in the hollow for years because going back felt like conceding the argument. A woman who had come up the ridge in the early morning and stood in the doorway and said, "Don't let them be right." Nora looked at the 3 feet of sealed wall. Then she got up and went back to the creek. She worked until the light failed. By the time she could no longer see clearly enough to judge her work, the north wall was fully sealed. Her hands had stopped hurting somewhere around the 3rd trip, which she understood was not a good sign, but which she accepted as the terms of the available bargain. She ate the small amount of dried biscuits she had packed in the burlap sack and drank water from the creek, breaking through the thin, new ice at the edge where the current kept it thinner. She went back to her corner. The sealed wall made a difference. Not a dramatic difference. The cabin was still cold enough to see, her breath still cold enough that sleep came in shallow intervals broken by shivers, but a real difference, the kind you can measure in the absence of wind on the back of your neck, in the slight modification of brutal into merely hard. She lay in her corner with her shawl pulled close and her cracked hands folded against her chest for warmth, and she thought, one day. One day done. One wall. Outside, the Montana winter settled its full weight onto the ridge. She slept. She was back at the creek before the light was fully up. This was the 2nd day, and she had learned things from the first. She had learned that her hands needed to be wrapped before she broke through the frozen crust. So she tore 2 strips from the hem of her oldest underskirt and wound them around her palms. She had learned that the clay mixed better when she let it sit for a few minutes after adding the grass, so she prepared 2 loads at once and alternated between them. She had learned that the caches in the east wall, though smaller than the north, were located lower down closer to the ground, where the cold pooled and settled, and those would need to be done next. Small lessons, practical lessons, the kind that cost you something to acquire. She worked through the morning with the focused economy of someone who has taken inventory of their available energy and has decided to spend it carefully. The east wall took less time than the north, The gaps were smaller, and she had found her rhythm now, her hands learning the right angle and pressure even through the wrapping. By the time the flat winter light had climbed to what she judged was late morning, the east wall was done. She stood back and looked at it. Two walls sealed, two remaining plus the roof, which she had not yet fully assessed, and which she was saving for when she could see it clearly in good light, and the chimney, which was its own separate problem, larger and more technical than anything she had yet attempted. The chimney was the thing that stood between her and fire was the thing that stood between her and the slow, patient erasure that this cold was attempting. She was thinking about the chimney, trying to understand what she actually knew about how chimneys were built, which was not much when she heard footsteps. Not Agnes's footsteps. Agnes moved through the woods with the quiet of someone who had been doing it for decades, barely a sound on the snow. These footsteps were heavier, more deliberate, the crunch of a larger person carrying more weight. They came from the south, from the direction of the trail, and they were unhurried. She picked up the trowel and positioned herself near the east wall. Not dramatically, not crouching or hiding, simply placing herself where she would have ground under her feet and a wall behind her if she needed it. The man who came around the corner of the cabin was tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were visible, even from 20 feet, as the hands of someone who worked with metal, large-knuckled, dark at the creases, with a stain that soap and water could diminish but never fully remove. He wore a heavy canvas coat and a wool cap pulled low, and over one shoulder he carried a leather roll of tools, the kind a craftsman keeps organized and accessible because the tools are how he thinks. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the patched north wall. He looked at the fresh chinking on the east wall. He looked at Nora standing near the corner with a trowel in her hand and two strips of underskirt wrapped around her palms. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years either side. The face was not remarkable except for the eyes, which were the particular gray of forge smoke and which looked at things the way a craftsman's eyes look, assisting, measuring, giving nothing away until the measurement was complete. "Mrs. Harrow," he said. His voice was deep and carried the warmth the air completely lacked. She had heard that voice before at the first inn on the south end of Main Street, directing an apprentice, discussing an order, but she had never been the one it was directed at. "Mr. Caleb," she said. His name was Caleb Marsh, and he had run the blacksmith operation in Harrow Creek for 15 years. And he was not someone she knew well, which meant he was not someone who owed her anything, which meant she had no idea why he was standing in her clearing. "Heard you came up here," he said. "Word travels," she said. "In Harrow Creek it does." He looked at the cabin again, at the sealed walls, at the debris around the collapsed chimney. "You've been busy." "I don't have the luxury of not being." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms a conclusion he had already reached. Then he set his tool roll down against the remains of the chimney and unrolled it, and she saw the range of what he had brought: chisels, a small mason's hammer, a folding rule, a coil of wire, and other implements, whose specific purposes she could not name, but whose quality was plain. "The chimney comes first," he said, kneeling beside the collapsed stones and beginning to sort through them with the systematic attention of someone cataloging what they have to work with. "You can survive a draft. You can't survive a winter without fire, and you can't have fire without a working chimney." He looked up at her. "The base is still sound. I can see the foundation stones from here. The problem is everything above the firebox height. Can it be rebuilt?" He picked up one of the fallen stones, turned it in his hands, set it aside, picked up another. "Most of these are still good," he said. "The mortar's what failed. It was never mixed right in the first place. Or it was, and the freeze-thaw got into it over the years. Either way, we can reuse the stone." He looked up at her again. "You'll need to mix the mortar. I'll place and set." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you here?" she said. He considered the question as though it deserved consideration. "Sheriff Vance mentioned you'd come up," he said. "Said a woman bought the North Ridge cabin and walked up in February with a sack and $5 worth of deed." He paused, looking at the stone in his hand. "I wanted to see if the story was accurate." And he set the stone down. "It's accurate," he said. He stood up. "You want to start on this chimney or not?" She wanted to ask more. She wanted to understand the full picture of why a man who had no particular connection to her had walked 3 miles up a ridge in February with a roll of tools. But she had been alone in the cold for 2 days, and there was a chimney to rebuild. and the kind of help that arrives without requiring extensive explanation is rare enough that it deserves to be accepted without interrogating it to death. "Tell me how to mix the mortar," she said. He told her. It was more complex than the clay, chinking a specific ratio of materials, specific consistency, specific application timing. She listened carefully and did not ask him to repeat himself. Then she went to work. They built in silence. This was she quickly understood how Caleb Marsh preferred to work, not because he was unfriendly, but because the work itself was a form of communication that he found more reliable than conversation. When she handed him a stone at the wrong angle for the placement he had in mind, he adjusted it in her hands without comment. When her mortar was too wet, he added the dry material himself and handed the batch back. When she asked a technical question only twice, both times precise, both times necessary, he answered in the fewest words that accuracy permitted. By mid-afternoon, the firebox had been cleared and the base had been relaid, and the first two courses of the chimney body were rising above the hearth. She could see the shape of it now, the way the stones stacked and interlocked, the way the mortar held them in a relationship that was stronger than either element alone. They stopped to rest, both of them, sitting on the remains of a fallen beam, their breath rising in small clouds. "Edmund came to see you," she said. It was not a question. She had been turning it over since she had first seen him in the clearing, and she had arrived at the certainty of it by a route that was part reasoning and part knowledge of the man. Caleb looked at the chimney. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "before you came up here." "2 days ago," he said. "Came to the forge in the evening after I'd closed up. Said a woman had bought the old Fenwick property," that's what he called it, "the old Fenwick property, not your cabin, and that it would be a waste of anyone's time to help her because she wouldn't last the month." He paused. He said it the way a man says something he wants you to understand is settled. He wasn't suggesting. He was informing me of how things were. The name Fenwick landed in her chest. Agnes's husband. The old Fenwick property. The floor he had given up on. "What did you tell him?" she said. Caleb picked up a small stone from the ground beside him and turned it in his fingers. "I told him I appreciated the information," he said. "Then I came up here." She looked up at him. "A man who tries to stop someone from receiving honest help isn't giving me information," he said. "He's giving me instructions. And I don't take instructions from men like that." He set the stone down. "You've done good work on these walls. The chinking is even. You packed it right." He stood up. "Let's get this chimney finished before the light goes." They worked until they could not see clearly, which in Montana in February meant stopping earlier than either of them wanted to. The chimney was not finished. It lacked the upper courses and the cap, but the firebox was complete, and the flue began, and Caleb had brought a small amount of cured mortar that he said would set overnight and be ready for the upper work tomorrow. He gathered his tools and rolled them back into their leather casing with the systematic attention he gave everything. He stood and looked at what they had built. "The roof," he said, "the northwest corner. Have you been up there?" "Not yet." "You need to be. The collapse you can see from inside is the smaller problem. There's a section on the upper slope above where the beam came down, where the boards have separated. You won't see it from below. Get up there in morning light and find it." He untied something from the back of his coat, a canvas bag which he set on the floor near the hearth. "Nails and a hammer. The boards themselves you'll need to find on site or pull from the interior wall sections that aren't structural." She looked at the bag. "The forge has scrap iron," he said. "I've been meaning to make door hardware for the south-facing properties in town. When you're ready for a proper door latch, come down." He paused. "If you finish the roof." "I'll finish it," she said. He looked at her with those forge smoke eyes, and something passed through them that was not quite a smile but was related to the expression a craftsman wears when he has looked at a piece of work in progress and seen that it is going to hold. "I know," he said. Then he nodded once and walked back through the clearing and down the trail, and the sound of his footsteps faded quickly into the silence of the trees. She stood in the cabin alone, looking at the half-built chimney and the bag of nails. For the first time since the back door of Edmund Harrow's kitchen had closed behind her, she felt the particular weight of not being alone in something. It was not a comfortable feeling exactly. She had spent enough time alone to have become cautious about dependence, But it was real, and it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She ate the last of her dried biscuit that night, sitting against the east wall with her knees pulled up and the cold pressing in from the unfinished chimney corner. She was running out of food. Tomorrow she would need to think about that. But tomorrow was tomorrow, and tonight there was a half-built chimney that would be ready for its upper courses in the morning, and there was a bag of nails that represented someone's decision to come 3 miles up a ridge rather than follow instructions. And there was the sealed north wall and the sealed east wall holding steady against the night. She slept better than she had slept in a week. On the third morning, she went up on the roof. It was as bad as Caleb had implied, and he had not implied it was good. The northwest corner, which she had seen collapse from below, was only the visible expression of a larger problem. 3 courses of roofing boards along the upper slope had separated at their joints, leaving gaps that in summer would have admitted rain and light, and in February were admitting snow and the deep creeping cold that snow carries with it and deposits wherever it lands. She found boards. She pulled 2 from the interior wall section near the old chimney collapse, where the wall was not load-bearing and the boards were doing nothing useful. She carried them up the side of the cabin, using the log notching as a ladder hauled herself onto the roof by main force, and began. The wind on the roof was different from the wind on the ground. On the ground, the trees broke. It redirected it, reduced it to something that could be endured. On the roof, there was nothing between her and the full, unfiltered intention of the Montana February air, and that air had intentions that were not friendly. She worked anyway. The hammer rang against the nails with a sound that she felt more than heard in the wind. Her hands even wrapped communicated sensation mostly through temperature differential. She could tell a cold surface from a very cold surface, but the finer gradations of touch had been suspended. She drove nails by attention and position rather than feel, watching her hand place the nail and watching her other hand swing the hammer and watching the nail descend into the board, operating the whole system visually because the tactile channel had been closed by cold. It was slow work. She found the separated sections by feel and eye, running her wrapped palm along the roof surface until she found where light came through, then placing and nailing boards over those sections. Where she had no boards, she used the canvas sacking from her burlap bag, cutting it into panels with a small knife she kept in her kit, laying the panels over the gaps, weighting them with stones she had hauled up the side of the cabin. The stones were the worst part. Each one required a separate trip down and up, arms wrapped around a chunk of granite or sandstone while she climbed the log notching with her feet alone, her whole body reminding her at each step that this was not how she was designed, that she was exceeding the reasonable operational parameters, that a rest would be appreciated. She did not rest. She was on the roof for 4 hours. When she came down more carefully than she had gone up, her arms and shoulders announcing their grievances. Clearly, she stood in the clearing and looked up at her work. The canvas patches were visible pale against the darker weathered boards weighted with stones like a quilt pinned down against wind. It was not beautiful. A craftsman would have found it wanting, but it was sealed and it would hold against ordinary snowfall, and it had been done with what she had. She went back up the next day and found 2 more gaps she had missed. She sealed those 2. On the 4th day, Caleb came back. He said nothing about the roof, but she saw him look at it, and she saw the small adjustment of expression that meant he had assessed it and found it acceptable. He finished the upper chimney courses in the morning, working with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been thinking about the problem since he'd left, and by early afternoon the chimney was complete. He checked the flue with a strip of cloth, dropped it in, watched which way it moved, adjusted the smoke shelf with a flat stone. He looked at her. "Try it," he said. She had been thinking about this moment for 4 days. She had been thinking about it with the part of her mind that runs underneath the working part, the part that keeps going while the hands are busy with other things. She had been thinking about what it would mean, not abstractly, but concretely, practically, to have fire in this room. She had a small quantity of kindling she had gathered from the dry inner branches of fallen trees along the creek. She had 3 sticks of pine from a deadfall she had broken apart by hand. She had dried grass and a piece of paper from the deed's backing. She arranged them in the firebox the way she had built fires her whole life, small material at the center, larger around it, the whole structure balanced to allow air to move through from below. She struck the flint. The first spark fell into the dry grass and died. The second one caught. She leaned forward and breathed on it carefully with the controlled breath of someone who has been waiting for this and does not want to blow it out. The grass accepted the spark and gave it back as a small, fragile flame orange at the tip of each blade, moving in the breath she was providing. She added the kindling. The flame hesitated, shrank, considered, hesitated again. Then it made its decision and rose, reaching into the kindling with a sound that was not loud, but was the most specific sound she had heard in 4 days, the sound of combustion of heat making itself from available material, of the equation of fire solving itself in real time. She sat back on her heels and watched it grow. Caleb was behind her. She could feel his presence, the warmth of another body in a cold room, but she did not turn around. She watched the fire. It moved into the pine sticks. It filled the firebox. It sent its first real heat out into the room. Tentative at first, then less tentative, a spreading warmth that did not solve the cold but opposed it, staked a claim against it, drew a line in the frozen air and said this far, no further. The smoke went up the chimney cleanly. The flue worked. She put her hands out toward the fire and felt them begin slowly and painfully to return to themselves. "You have a strong back," Caleb said behind her. "Most people in your position would have found a room in town by now." "Begging doesn't keep you warm," she said. "Only fire does." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll leave you more nails. You should reinforce the door frame before hard weather comes." He set down what he'd brought, a second canvas bag, heavier than the first, and gathered his things. At the doorway he stopped. "Come down to the forge when you're ready for that latch," he said. "I meant it." She turned then and looked at him. The fire was behind her and it was putting light into the room. Real light, warm-colored light, and she could see his face clearly for the first time, the gray eyes with their craftsman's steadiness, the lines around them that came from years of squinting into forge heat. "Thank you, Caleb," she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has done what he came to do and considers the matter complete, and walked back down the trail. She sat by the fire for an hour. Just sat. Let the warmth work. Let the sound of it, the soft, continuous voice of burning wood, fill the room, the way silence had been filling it for 4 days. She watched the light it made on the walls, on the fresh chinking, on the carefully placed chimney stones. She let herself, for one guarded hour, simply be warm. Then she got up and reinforced the door frame. The knock came at dusk. She opened the door to find a girl of perhaps 10 or 11, small and serious, in a coat that was good quality, but had been let out twice at the seams to accommodate growing. She was holding an iron pot wrapped in a folded towel, and the smell that came off it reached Nora before any words did. Beef and root vegetables, and something herbed, the smell of a kitchen that had been warm all day. "My mother sent this," the girl said. Her name was Bess Calloway, and Nora knew her mother slightly, a quiet woman who ran the millinery and kept her opinions to herself, which in Harrow Creek was not a common practice. "She said you must be hungry." Nora took the pot. The warmth of it came through the towel and into her hands, and she held it for a moment before she could speak. "Tell your mother I'm grateful," she said. Bess looked past her into the cabin. Her eyes moved around the room with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. She saw the fresh chinking in the rebuilt chimney, and the fire in the hearth, and the organized arrangement of Nora's few possessions along the east wall. "It's nice," Bess said, with the directness that children bring to observations that adults would soften. "It smells like pine and wood smoke." "Come in out of the cold," Nora said. Bess stepped inside and stood near the fire, warming her hands with the unself-conscious practicality of the young. She looked at the chimney. "My father said that chimney was beyond fixing," she said. "Most things people say are beyond fixing can be fixed," Nora said. "They just require more work than people are willing to do." Bess considered this with the serious expression of a child filing information away for later use. Then she looked at Nora directly. "Are you going to stay?" she said. "Yes," Nora said. Bess nodded, satisfied, as though she had needed confirmation of something she had already suspected. "Good," she said. She turned toward the door. "I should get back before dark." "Thank you for bringing this," Nora said. Bess smiled, then briefly a child's smile, uncomplicated and complete. She went out the door and down the trail, and Nora watched her go until the trees took her. She ate the stew by the fire. She had not realized until the first spoonful how far past hunger she had been operating. The body becomes accustomed to doing without, and the mechanism of want goes quiet after a while, but it does not go away. It simply waits. And when food arrives, it wakes up all at once, and the eating that follows is less like eating and more like restoration, the careful refilling of something that had been running on its reserves. She ate slowly. She made it last. When she finished, she sat for a while in the warmth of her own fire in her own cabin, listening to the sounds of the Montana winter working against her walls and not getting through. The chinking held. The roof held. The chimney drew clean. She stepped outside to bring in more wood from the stack she had started building along the south wall, and that was when she saw the sky. It had changed. An hour ago, it had been the ordinary dark of a winter night, cold and clear, with the particular brightness of stars at altitude. Now it was different. The stars were gone. The moon was gone. What had replaced them was a low, heavy darkness, a ceiling of cloud that seemed to begin almost at treetop level and press downward, a darkness that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something else, weight and tension, the particular quality of sky that carries serious weather. The air had gone completely still. She stood for a moment with a wand under each arm and felt the stillness and looked at the sky and understood what she was looking at. She had grown up in this country. She knew what it meant when the stars disappeared and the wind stopped and the clouds came down low and the air went still as a held breath. She went back inside. She put the logs on the fire and added 2 more on top of those. She checked the door frame she had reinforced that afternoon. She checked the roof patches through the window as much as she could see in the dark. Agnes came to the door. She appeared in the darkness without warning, as she seemed to do. One moment the doorway was empty, and the next she was there, her mismatched coat dusted with light snow, her sharp eyes bright in the firelight. "Storm coming," she said. "I know," Nora said. "Come in." Agnes came inside and stood near the fire and held her hands over it. She looked at the rebuilt chimney with the expression of someone assessing work against a standard. "He came back," she said. Not a question. "Caleb, yes," Agnes nodded. "He's a straight man." She looked at the fire. "Edmund's been asking questions about your deed." Nora looked at her. "I hear things in the hollow," Agnes said. "People talk near the tree line when they think no one's listening. Edmund's been at the land office, asking about the original survey, the tax records, the chain of title." She paused. "He's looking for something to pull on." "Can he find anything?" Agnes met her eyes. "That depends on whether Vance filed the paperwork right," she said, "and on whether Vance has the spine to back it up if Edmund pushes." Nora was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "I'll talk to Vance," she said. "Before the storm," Agnes said. "After it, the roads will be closed for days." She looked at the low ceiling of the cabin, the patched roof, the new chimney. "You've done good work here, girl. Real work, the kind that stands." She said it simply, without particular warmth, the way you state a fact you have verified. She left the same way she had arrived, abruptly, without ceremony, walking back into the dark, as though the night was simply another room she had business in. Nora went to the fire. She sat and thought about Edmund in the land office, turning pages with his careful hands, looking for a thread loose enough to pull. She thought about the deed in her petticoat pocket, the ink that Vance had signed with his slow, deliberate hand, the 5 coins she had placed on that railing. She thought about the paper her husband had left behind, the note Edmund had referenced that night in the kitchen, the thing he had not named directly, the something between them that had died with Thomas. She did not know what it had said. She did not know if it had been destroyed or saved or transformed into something else. She only knew that Edmund had moved quickly, quietly, and with purpose, and that people who move that way are rarely finished. She banked the fire for the night, adding the largest logs she had to the back of the firebox so they would burn slowly and hold the heat as long as possible. She arranged her sleeping corner as warmly as she could manage. She lay down. The storm hit while she was still awake. It did not begin gradually. There was the stillness, and then there was not the stillness, and the not stillness arrived all at once with the full-throated violence of weather that has gathered itself for a long time in the northern distances and has finally arrived at the place it has been aimed at. The first gust hit the cabin like a hand that meant to push it off the ridge. The walls held. West. She lay in her corner and listened to the storm do its work against the structure she had spent 4 days repairing, and she felt every sound separately. The wind against the north wall she had, chinking sealed by hand, the groan of the roof boards under the accumulating weight, the whistle of air finding the small imperfections in the work she had done. The chinking held, the roof held, The fire in the hearth answered the howling outside with its own steady voice, low and continuous, the sound of heat maintaining itself against the cold. She closed her eyes. She had done what she could do. The rest was between the cabin and the storm, and she had given the cabin what she had. She breathed slowly in the dark, feeling the warmth on her face from the fire 10 feet away. Tomorrow she would go down to see Vance. She would walk 3 miles in whatever the storm left behind, and she would stand in his office, and she would make sure the deed held. She would find out what Edmund was looking for. She would deal with whatever he found. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was a fire in the hearth of the cabin she had bought for $5 and rebuilt with bleeding hands, and outside, the worst storm in recent memory was trying to prove that she did not belong on this ridge, and the walls were holding. She slept. The storm did not stop that night. It did not stop the next morning either. It kept itself in place above the ridge with the patience of something that has no appointments and no competing obligations, feeding on the cold air that poured down from the northern ranges and expressing that cold air as snow and wind and the particular violence of weather that has decided to make a point. She lay in her corner and listened to it make that point against her walls. The fire had burned down to coals by the time she woke, and the room was cold again, in the way a room goes cold when the fire has been keeping it only marginally above outside temperature, and the fire has diminished, not the brutal cold of the first night, but a serious cold, the kind that reminds you that warm and safe are things you have to keep earning. She fed the fire. She used 2 of the larger logs she had stored against the south wall, placing them carefully on the coals with the economy of someone who knows how many logs remain and is doing arithmetic in her head. The fire accepted them and grew. She went to the door and tried to open it. It did not open. She pushed harder. The door, which she had rehung and reinforced, which Caleb had called solid work, held completely. She put her shoulder against it and pushed with her legs and felt the resistance of something that was not mechanical, not a broken latch or a swollen frame, but simply weight, snow weight. The storm had piled it against the door through the night, and what she was pushing against was not a door problem, but a weather problem. She looked around the cabin. The iron skillet was hanging on the wall peg, where she had put it, a heavy flat-bottom pan she had bought with the last of the trade credit she'd held at the hardware store before she left town. She took it down. She went to the door and worked the blade of the skillet into the gap between door and frame at the bottom, using it as a lever, pushing and rocking, breaking the seal of packed snow incrementally. She worked her way up the frame, then started again at the bottom. On the third pass, the door gave 2 inches, then 6, then enough for her to force an arm through and begin scooping snow away from the outside surface. It took 20 minutes. When the door finally swung open, she was looking at a wall of white that began at ground level and rose to her chest. She stared at it for a moment. Then she began digging. The skillet was not designed for this, but it was what she had, and she used it in the tight chopping strokes of someone who has committed to a task and is focusing entirely on the next 6 inches rather than the full distance. She carved a channel through the snow, working forward and angling upward, aiming for the surface. The snow was dense and heavy, not the light powder of early season, but the compressed, waterlogged snow of a storm that had been falling for hours and had packed itself under its own weight. She dug. Her shoulders burned. The skillet rang against the occasional buried stone. The channel grew. When daylight broke through above her, she stopped and straightened and blinked at the brightness of a world that was entirely white. The storm had stopped. Not gradually, not with a period of diminishing, simply stopped, the way a very loud sound stops, leaving behind a silence that feels like a new element. The sky above the clearing was a hard, scrubbed blue, the kind of blue that only exists after a serious storm has scoured the atmosphere clean of everything tentative. She climbed out of the channel and stood on top of the snow and looked at the ridge. The trees at the clearing's edge were changed. 2 of the aspens she had been looking at for a week had come down, not fallen slowly but broken. The trunks snapped at mid-height with the clean violence of something that exceeded what they were built to hold. One of them had come down across the trail. Another lay in the clearing itself, its upper branches reaching toward the cabin wall close enough that she could see the gray lichen on the bark. She turned and looked at the cabin. The roof was still there. The patches she had made the canvas weighted with stones, the boards she had nailed in the wind, were still in place. One of the stone weights had shifted, and a corner of canvas was lifting in the light breeze that had followed the storm, but the patch was holding. She looked at the south wall where her woodpile was stacked. Half of it was buried. She would need to dig it out before the next night. She looked at the trail south toward the valley. From the ridge, she could see down into Harrow Creek, or rather, she could see the place where Harrow Creek should be visible, the particular arrangement of roof lines and chimney stacks, and the white steeple of the church that marked the town from above. She knew what she was looking for. She had been looking down at that valley for a week. What she saw now stopped her. The arrangement was wrong. She looked for a long time trying to resolve what she was seeing against what she knew. The steeple was there tilted, she thought, though at this distance she could not be certain. The roof lines were wrong in a way she could not immediately quantify, wrong in the way a room is wrong when something large has been moved or removed and the eye keeps trying to put it back. There were gaps where there should have been structures. There were shapes that didn't resolve into buildings. So she understood then. The snow, the weight of it over 2 days on roofs that had not been built for this particular calculation. She stood on top of the snowpack and looked at the town below and understood that the storm had done down there what it had tried to do up here, and that down there had been no one doing what she had done. She went back inside and fed the fire again. She melted snow in the iron pot for water and drank 2 cups standing by the hearth. She put on every layer she owned. She picked up the trowel which she kept on the shelf near the door. Agnes's trowel, the first tool anyone had given her, and put it in her pocket. Then she went out to dig out her woodpile. She worked for 2 hours. She found all but the bottom row of logs which she left buried since the snow was acting as insulation around them, and she could retrieve them as needed. She stacked the recovered wood against the south wall and covered the top of the stack with the canvas she had taken from her pack. She was carrying the last armload of logs back to the stack when she heard them. Voices, multiple voices coming from the direction of the trail. Not close yet, maybe half a mile down the slope, but in the absolute silence of the post-storm ridge, sound carried with strange clarity. She could hear the particular labor of people moving through deep snow, the effort sounds of breathing and footfall, the occasional exchange of words, and under all of that, a sound she had not heard in 4 days' children. She set down the logs. She walked to the edge of the clearing and looked south down the trail where the tree line opened up enough to see 50 yards of the approach. What she saw was a line of people, not 2 or 3, a line of genuine procession, the kind of movement that happens when enough people are going to the same place in the same conditions that they have fallen into single file to use each other's tracks. At the front was a figure she recognized by his compact, purposeful way of moving through difficult ground, Sheriff Vance. His gray mustache was visible even at this distance, and he was moving with the particular urgency of a man who has a destination and is not stopping to discuss it. Beside him, keeping pace, was Caleb. Behind them came others. She counted 8, then 12, then more, as the line came around the curve of the trail. She saw Bess's mother from the millinery, her arms around a child. She saw 2 of the older men from the feed store. She saw families, actual families, parents and children, and elderly people being supported by younger ones. And at the back of the line, moving slowly, using a length of pine branch as a walking stick in the deep snow, was Edmund Harrow. She stood at the edge of the clearing and watched them come. She had been alone on this ridge for 6 days. 6 days of cold and physical labor and the internal negotiations that solitude requires. 6 days of building something from the wreckage of what she had been given, without an audience, without acknowledgement, without anyone to tell her whether what she was doing was working, until the storm hit and the walls held and the chimney drew and the answer became evident on its own terms. And now they were coming up her trail with their children and their inadequate winter clothes, and the particular desperate quality of people who have lost their shelter and are moving toward the only warmth they know is burning. Vance reached the clearing first. He stopped when he saw her standing there, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the sheriff of Harrow Creek and the woman who had walked out of town 6 days ago with $5 in a burlap sack. "Mrs. Harrow," he said. His voice was rough, not from cold, but from something else. "The town hall roof came down night before last. The general store—" He stopped. "Half the main street structures have damage. Some are gone entirely. We have children who've been in the cold since yesterday morning." She looked past him at the line of people still moving through the trees. "How many?" she said. 23, he said. maybe more coming behind us. She looked at her cabin. She looked at the hearth through the open door, the fire she had built and fed and coaxed back from coals this morning, burning steadily now in the chimney she and Caleb had rebuilt stone by stone. She looked at the people coming through the trees. She stepped back from the door and opened it wide. "Bring them in," she said. "There is room at my fire." They came in slowly the way people enter a space they weren't sure would be available to them. Cautious, humbled, taking in the dimensions of the room and adjusting their expectations to match it. The children went to the hearth first, as children always do, pulled by instinct toward warmth before their parents had finished deciding it was permitted. The elderly came next, guided by younger arms to the walls where they could sit with their backs supported. The others arranged themselves in the remaining space with the cooperative efficiency of people who understand that comfort is no longer the objective and survival is. 23 people in a one-room cabin that she had bought for $5 and rebuilt with bleeding hands and 2 borrowed tools. It was not comfortable, but it was warm. Caleb came in last among the first group and positioned himself near the door, without being asked, his broad shoulders against the frame, his presence there as steady as a structural element. He looked at her across the crowded room with those forged smoke eyes and gave the small nod of a craftsman looking at something that is bearing the load it was built for. Then Edmund came through the door. He came through at last after everyone else, which was not how Edmund Harrow moved through doors. Edmund moved through doors first with the natural authority of a man who owns things and knows it. He moved through her door last and without authority, stepping carefully over the legs of people sitting on the floor, and when he straightened inside the room, his eyes went immediately to the walls, to the chinking she had packed by hand, in the cold to the chimney stones he had told Caleb not to help her lay to the roof boards she had nailed in the wind with hands that had forgotten how to feel. He looked at all of it. He looked at it the way a man looks at an argument he made with confidence, and then watched disproved, not with the clean concession of someone who never minded being wrong, but with the slower, more difficult expression of someone encountering the evidence that they were wrong about something they had been certain of. He did not speak. Not yet. He found a space along the south wall and lowered himself to the floor, and Nora did not look at him again because there was too much else to do. She put water on to heat. She had 2 pots and the iron skillet, and she used all 3, filling them with snow that she brought in by the armload and set near the fire to melt. When the water was warm, she passed it around in whatever vessels she had, 2 tin cups, a ceramic mug, a bowl, and they went around the room and came back and went around again. She had grain. Not much, a cloth sack of cornmeal she had traded a day's mending for at the feed store before she left town, which she had been rationing with the strictness of someone who does not know when the next supply will come. She mixed it with the warm water and what salt she had and made a thin porridge stretched as far as it would go, and she passed that around too. It was not enough to satisfy. It was enough to sustain. She worked without stopping, without sitting down, without eating any of the porridge herself, until she had made certain that every child had received a portion and every elderly person had been served. She moved through this crowded room with the focused calm of someone who has found their purpose and is executing it, and the people in the room watched her do it with the particular attention that people give to competence in an emergency, the gratitude that has no time for ceremony. Vance watched her from his place near the north wall. He had been watching her since he arrived. She could feel it, and at some point in the afternoon he made his way through the room to stand beside her near the fire. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice was low, not meant to carry. She handed the emptied pot to a woman near the hearth who had volunteered to go for more snow. She looked at Vance. "Edmund went to the land office," she said. "I know." Something moved across his face. "He found something," Vance said, "or thought he did." The original survey from 1871 had a boundary discrepancy. The north edge of this parcel was marked twice different distances, and he was building a case that the second marking put the cabin outside the legal parcel boundaries, which would mean the county couldn't sell it as a separate lot. He paused. "He came to me with it 2 days before the storm. And," she said, "and I had already had the survey reviewed," he said. "Where you bought the deed, I had the county assessor look at both markings and issue a correction. The second mark was a drafting error from 1871. The parcel is exactly what you bought." He looked at her steadily. "Your deed is airtight, Mrs. Harrow." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. I should have done more than that, he said, a long time ago. He looked at the room full of people. Thomas told his father he wanted you to have this place. I was in that room. I heard him say it. He stopped, looked at the fire. Edmund told him it was foolishness that the property wasn't suitable, that there was no reason to make a formal arrangement. Thomas didn't push back. He was young and he was sick, and he didn't know how sick. He looked at her again. I should have said something. To you, at least. You should have known. She stood for a moment with the knowledge of this settling through her. Thomas had wanted this for her. Thomas had said it out loud in the presence of witnesses, and it had been quietly set aside by a man who knew how to set things aside without raising his voice. She had come to this ridge, not knowing she was going where she had been meant to go. She did not know what to do with that exactly. It was too large and too mixed with grief and with something else. Something that was not quite vindication and not quite peace, but lived in the territory between them. It doesn't change what I built, she said. No, Vance said. It doesn't. She nodded once. Then she went to get more snow for the pot. The first day passed that way, warm water and thin porridge and the management of 23 people in one room with one fire. She kept the fire at a steady medium rather than pushing it hot because a hot fire would burn through her wood supply in half the time, and she did not know how long they would need the cabin to hold. Caleb understood this without being told. At some point in the afternoon, he went outside and came back an hour later, having located and excavated a section of her buried woodpile and added to it from a deadfall he had found at the clearing's edge. He stacked it against the south wall, inside the cabin, out of the weather, and said nothing about it. The children, after the initial warmth had taken hold, became children again, which was the best possible sign. They played the games that children play when confined to small spaces, quiet games that involved whispered rules and careful movements and the occasional suppressed laugh. Bess was among them and her mother nearby, and she caught Nora's eye once across the room and gave her the same brief, uncomplicated smile she had offered at the door 3 days ago. That evening, as the light went and the fire became the room's only illumination, the cabin settled into the specific intimacy of people who have been through something together and know it. Conversations happened, low, overlapping, the kind that fill the time without needing to be important. Children fell asleep against their parents. The elderly dozed against the walls. Nora sat near the hearth, feeding the fire in the measured way she had learned to feed it, adding one log at a time at intervals she had calibrated over the past 4 days. The warmth moved outward from the stones, and she watched it reach the faces of the people in her room, and she felt something she could not have named at the beginning of the week. Some compound of exhaustion and satisfaction, and the particular tenderness that comes from having given something you weren't sure you had. Edmund had been quiet all day. He sat against the south wall in the space he had claimed when he entered, and he watched. He watched Nora move through the room. He watched the fire. He watched the walls. He had accepted water and porridge when they came around, taking neither more nor less than anyone else, and he had spoken only when addressed. In the late evening, when the cabin had grown quiet around them and most of the room was asleep, or nearly so, he spoke. He did not speak loudly. He spoke the way he always spoke, quietly, with precision, in a voice calibrated to reach one person. But this time the voice contained something she had never heard in it before. Not warmth exactly. Something that had been compressed inside warmth for a long time and had finally decided to come out. He told me he wanted you to have this place, Edmund said. She looked at him across the sleeping forms between them. The fire was between them too, its light moving on his face, on the lines of it, the angular jaw, the eyes that had looked at her for 6 years with the expression of a final decision. Those eyes looked different now, not soft. Edmund Harrow's eyes would not go soft. But the finality was different. The decision it expressed had changed. I know, she said quietly. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, the slow, difficult expression of a man encountering his own error in the form of irrefutable physical evidence. Every sealed wall, every chimney stone, every nail driven in wind and cold. I didn't believe you could keep it, he said. He said it simply, without defense, the way you say a thing when you have decided that the defense of it costs more than the honesty. I thought, he stopped, considered, began again. I thought you were something that happened to Thomas, not something that was part of him. He looked at the room full of people sleeping on her floor. at the chimney he had tried to prevent from being built. I was wrong. The words were quiet, 3 of them. From a man who had spent 6 years arranging the world with his certainty they cost something real. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 5 coins. She thought about the quilt she had sewn from her childhood and sold on a winter afternoon to a woman who hadn't haggled. She thought about the frozen clay and the cracked fingernails and the 4 hours on the roof in the wind and the first spark that caught in the dry grass and became a fire. She thought about Thomas, who had looked at this ridge and seen something for her that she had found on her own terms anyway. She stood up and went to the fire and added a log, positioning it carefully at the back of the firebox where it would catch slowly and burn long. She watched the flame accept it. "Help me rebuild the store right," she said without turning around. "That's enough." She heard him exhale. Not dramatically, just the breath of a man setting something down. "Fair enough," he said. She did not turn around. She watched the fire and let the room breathe around her and held what had just happened carefully, the way you hold something that is both fragile and heavier than it looks. The second day was easier than the first. People had slept, which changed everything. Sleep and warmth after cold is a profound restorer, and the faces in the cabin that morning had a different quality than the faces that had come through her door the afternoon before. More present, more capable. She made porridge again, thinner now because the grain was running low, but she had found a cache of dried beans in the bottom of her burlap sack that she had forgotten she packed, and she set those soaking in the morning. By midday, they were soft enough to add to the pot, and the result was something that qualified as food in the way that mattered most, which was that it kept people going. People began to organize themselves. This is what people do when the immediate crisis has been managed and the next phase is visible. They begin to apply their particular competencies to the shared problem. 2 of the men took over the wood retrieval, going out in pairs to expand the area Caleb had worked the day before. One of the women, who turned out to have medical training from a period of her life she didn't elaborate on, moved through the room, checking on the elderly and the children with quiet professional efficiency. Bess's mother came to Nora in the afternoon and asked what she needed done. "Check the roof patches on the northwest corner," Nora said. "One of the stone weights shifted in the storm. If the canvas is lifting, I need to know." She went. She came back and reported that the canvas was lifting at 2 corners and that a section had come loose from the stone. Nora went out and fixed it with Bess's mother holding the ladder, which was the log notching, which required a degree of confidence in one's handholds and handing up tools. On the second night, the mood in the cabin shifted further towards something that was no longer emergency and not yet normal, but existed between them, a temporary community with its own emerging customs. People took turns tending the fire through the night, each person watching for 2 hours, so that no one person had to do it alone. Nora slept for 4 consecutive hours for the first time since before the storm. She woke to find Caleb had taken the last watch and was sitting beside the fire in the early morning dark, completely still, with the alert patience of someone for whom stillness is a professional skill. She sat up and looked at him. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated regard that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things, assessingly without performance. "How long have you been doing everything alone?" She thought about the question. It was not as simple as it appeared. "Long enough that it feels normal," she said. He nodded as though this confirmed something. "It doesn't have to," he said. Then he added a log to the fire and went back to watching it, and the conversation was apparently complete. On the 3rd morning, the paths opened. It happened gradually. The temperature rose slightly, just enough to settle the surface snow, and 2 of the men who had been going out for wood reported that the trail south was passable on foot, difficult but passable. The word moved through the cabin with the particular energy of information that changes what is possible. People began to prepare to leave. This too had its own quality. The gathering of what little they had brought, the checking of children's layers, the exchange between people who have been through something together of a certain look, a certain compression of acknowledgement that does not require much language. They left through the morning in small groups, following each other's tracks south toward the valley. Each person who passed through the door said something to Nora, some at length, some just her name, some with only a press of the hand or a held look that carried more than most sentences. The woman with the medical training stopped and held Nora's hands in both of hers for a moment before she went. Bess, going out with her mother, turned at the door. "Will you come down to town?" she said. "When there's reason to," Nora said. Bess considered this. "I think there's reason," she said seriously. Then she went through the door and down the trail, and her mother followed. Agnes appeared in the doorway as the last of the townspeople were leaving, as though she had been waiting at the tree line for the crowd to clear. She looked at the cabin at the interior, at the people still filing out at the tended fire, and the organized space. "You fed them for 3 days," she said. "I had grain," Nora said. Agnes looked at her. "You had enough grain to feed yourself for 2 weeks," she said. "You turned it into 3 days for 23 people." She was quiet for a moment. "Fenwick would not have done that," she said. "He would have kept the door closed." She said it without accusation, without grief, as a simple fact about a man she had known and lost. "I would have kept the door closed," she added. "I'm not sure I'm ashamed of that." "You gave me your trowel," Nora said. Agnes looked at the trowel on the shelf near the door. "Keep it," she said as she had said the first morning. Then she turned and walked back into the trees. Edmund left last among the adults standing at the door while others filed past him, the walking stick still in his hand, his coat still holding the creases of 3 days on a hard floor. He looked at the cabin one more time from the doorway. "I'll send lumber up the trail when the road's clear," he said. "Whatever you need for the roof." "I'll make a list," she said. He looked at her. Then he nodded and went down the trail, and his footsteps faded into the sounds of the retreating group, and the clearing was quiet again. She stood in the open doorway for a long time. The valley below was beginning the long process of assessing itself. She could see movement down there, small figures moving between buildings, the particular activity of people measuring damage and beginning the calculations of repair. There was work ahead, months of it, the rebuilding of structures that had stood for years and had not stood for this. She would go down. Not today to day. There was a cabin to clean and a wood pile to restock and a roof to properly assess in full daylight. But soon, she would go down and look at what remained and put her eyes on the problems that needed solving. Vance had mentioned the building work, a position that was not a title, not a contract, not a thing that 1887 Montana had a formal name for. Simply, people need structures that hold, and you understand how structures hold, and we need your eyes. She had spent a week learning by doing the most immediate version of that problem, and she had learned enough to know how much more there was to learn, and that knowledge felt like a beginning rather than a limit. She turned back to the cabin. She looked at it the way she had looked at it every day since she arrived, with the eyes of someone who knows exactly what went into every inch of it. The north wall packed solid, the east wall sealed, the south and west walls that had needed less work but had received her attention anyway. The chimney rising clean and straight above the roof line, its stones fitted in the pattern that Caleb's hands had found and her mortar had held. The roof patches still in place, the canvas weighted, and the boards nailed. In the spring there would be more work. The roof needed proper boards to replace the canvas. The door needed real hinges and the latch Caleb had promised. The floor, still hard-packed dirt, needed planking. There was a window opening on the east wall that she had noticed, but not yet addressed, boarded over from the outside with a single plank. And she wanted light in that room. Real light, the light of Montana mornings coming in through actual glass. There was work ahead. There was always work ahead. That was not a complaint. She swept the cabin. She swept it thoroughly, pushing the debris of 23 people's 3-day occupation out the door with a broom she had made in her second week from a bundle of creek willow and a length of wire. She shook out the bedding. She washed the paste and the cups and the bowl in melted snow. She organized her remaining supplies on the shelf and took honest inventory, low but not empty, enough to last until the roads were passable enough for a supply run. She built the fire up to a proper warmth, not the conservation burn of the past 3 days, but the full, generous heat of a room that is being lived in by one person who does not need to ration what she has. She sat down in the chair she had made in her second week from a section of the collapsed beam and 2 shorter lengths of board joined with the nails Caleb had left. It was not elegant. It held her. She looked at the fire. Spring came the way spring comes after serious winters, tentatively, at first, then with gathering confidence, as though the season had been watching the land for signs of readiness and had finally decided it was safe to arrive. The snow retreated from the clearing, from the south, facing slopes, from the trail. The creak, which had been a concept buried under several feet of ice for months, reappeared as sound, first the specific sound of moving water, that is one of the more reliable announcements that the world is still capable of change. Nora went down to the valley 3 weeks after the storm on a morning when the trail was firm and the sky was clear, and she had a list in her coat pocket. She went to the forge first. Caleb was working. She could hear the hammer before she could see the building. The rhythmic report of iron being shaped, a sound that she had walked past 100 times without noticing, and that now had specific meaning to her. She waited at the door until he looked up. He looked at her for a moment. Then he set down his hammer. Roof latch, he said. Among other things, she said. She handed him the list. He read it. His expression moved through several small adjustments, not surprise exactly, but the steady revision that happens when what you expected is exceeded by what you find. He looked up at her. This is 6 months of ironwork, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking for it all at once. I'm not saying no, he said. He looked at the list again. The latch I have ready. I made it after the storm. He went to a shelf along the forge wall and came back with a piece of hardware, a door latch, solid iron with the clean lines of something made without excess. He set it in her hands. The rest we can talk about. She turned the latch over in her hands. It was heavier than she had expected, which was right. A latch should be heavy. It should mean something when it engages. What do I owe you, she said. He looked at her. We'll account for it, he said, which was not a number and was also, she understood, not nothing. It was the extension of something. She went to see Vance next. He was in his office, which smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and he stood when she came in a formal acknowledgement that had not happened the first time she had stood in this office. He told her about the building consultant work, which was what he was calling it. The county had money for reconstruction assessment. They needed someone who could look at a damaged structure and tell them whether to repair it or build from scratch and what materials and methods the finished structure would need to withstand future conditions. He had recommended her. The county surveyor had agreed. It's not a salary, Vance said. It's a fee per structure assessed. But there are 43 structures in the valley that need assessment. She did the arithmetic. It was more money than she had ever managed at one time. I'll need to work from the ridge, she said. The cabin is my base. Nobody's asking you to move, he said. She nodded. They shook hands, which was not common, but seemed correct under the circumstances, and she left. She walked down Main Street. It looked different than it had the morning she had walked it with a burlap sack and 5 coins. Some of that difference was the storm's damage, the gaps where structures had been, the buildings with hastily patched roofs, the general atmosphere of a place in the middle of putting itself back together. Some of it was the season, the thin early spring light, different from the February pewter that had colored everything on the day she left. But some of it was her. The way the street looked to her now was different because she was different, not transformed into someone else, not elevated into a version of herself she didn't recognize but clarified. She knew things now that she had not known on that February morning. She knew them in her hands and her shoulders, and the particular muscles that had driven nails and carried clay and pushed a door open against a wall of snow. She knew what she was made of. Edmund's store was half standing. The front section had lost its roof. The back was intact. He was outside when she came by, speaking to 2 men with lumber over their shoulders, directing the early stages of what would become a significant rebuild. He saw her. The men looked between them, the awkward awareness of people who have heard versions of a story and are not sure which version is operating in the present moment. Edmund looked at the men. Give us a minute, he said. They moved away. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them was 3 days on a hard floor and a word spoken quietly in firelight, and also 6 years of being told she did not belong, and also a dead man who had wanted her to have a cabin on a ridge and had not pushed hard enough to make sure she knew it. All of that was there. She was not going to pretend it wasn't. The back section is sound, Edmund said. He looked at the building with the eyes of a man who has been assessing structures his whole life, which he had and which was something they now had in common. The front needs to come down and start over. I want it built to last this time. Show me what's there, she said. He walked her through the building, the back rooms that had held the front section, where the roof had transferred its load wrong onto the walls, and the walls had not been made for that load. She looked at the corner joints in the wall plates and the foundation stones, and she asked questions, specific questions, the kind you ask when you are not performing expertise, but actually gathering information. He answered them. They stood in the wrecked front section of the store with the early spring light coming through the absent roof, and he told her what he wanted rebuilt, and she told him what she saw, and they talked practically about wood and stone and load and span and what this building needed to be in order to mean what he intended it to mean for the next 50 years. It was the longest real conversation they had ever had. At the end of it, she said, "I'll put together an assessment, same rate as the county work." "That's fair," he said. She left him there and walked back through the town and up the trail the 3 miles that she now knew by the specific quality of effort they required, past the frozen creek that was no longer frozen past the aspen stand, that was showing the first blush of green at its tips up the slope to the clearing. She stood on the porch she had built in her third week, 2 lengths of salvaged board, a simple rail, and looked out at the valley. The light was doing what spring light in Montana does in the late afternoon, coming in low and golden from the west, catching the edges of things, making the world look like it has been thought about carefully. The valley below was lit that way now, the rooftops of Harrow Creek, the meadows beyond the hills on the far side still holding their winter white at the peaks. She looked at her hands. They were not the hands she had brought up this ridge in February. The skin was rougher, the knuckles more defined, the calluses specific, this one from the trowel handle, that one from the hammer grip, the ridge along her right palm from the 1,000 times she had pressed clay into wood. They were the hands of someone who had done the work, every particular inch of it. She had taken a ruined cabin and made it a home. She had taken a community's collapse and made it a refuge. She had taken a man's certainty that she did not belong, and she had answered it in the only language that mattered, the language of things built and held and made to last. The ridge carried a wind light and warm from the south, the first warm wind in months. It moved through the clearing and through the aspen branches and past the cabin walls, and it did not find a way in because she had sealed every gap. She breathed out slowly. She was home.